Today we're talking about attractors. What are attractors in motor control theory, and human movement? We can think about movement as having multiple components, and some of those components are going to be fluctuating or adapting to the environment, adapting to the demands of the task. Say I step on a rock, I step on a piece of grass, the edge of the infield dirt versus the outfield grass, whether I'm talking about stepping and moving in one way, the ground slips a little bit. Things have to be able to fluctuate to adapt to the environment. But also we have to have things that remain stable throughout all movement to allow it to be successful. If everything fluctuated and everything adapted to the environment, we would not have stable, reproducible movement. If we have some components, potentially the key or most important components, remain stable, while we have other components that are able to be adapted to the environment, adapted to the task, and adapted to the capacity of the individual at the time of completing that task, then we're going to have a movement that is stable, reproducible, and can be done efficiently and effectively while simultaneously having components of the movement that can then adapt to the ever-changing variability that's encountered in any athletic or high-intensity skill. The stable components that we've been talking about here are known as the attractors. Remember, we have the fluctuators we could put on this side of the board. That's going to be everything else, essentially. Attractors can be broken down into many different variations with more specificity, but the real goal behind identifying attractors is to, one, create the most stable patterns from individual to individual, but also to simplify movement analysis so that when we look at movement analysis, we know what we need to train and what maybe the athlete does really well already or they don't do so well at. So they're not only diagnostic for the movement, but prognostic in that we can develop a prognosis and we can develop a diagnosis of what's going wrong here, how long is it going to take to correct it, and then it's going to be prescriptive in that we can then develop prescriptions or interventions based on what we see and based on how these attractors are working. There's many attractors. Franz Bosch, I have his book right here. He'll talk about numerous different universal attractors and other attractors in human movement. But what I've done in combination with some other individuals is take some of what we see in that book and some of what we see in real life in the throw specifically, so for throwing athletes, and we've narrowed it down to a few attractors that we see as the most important. Understand that with the plethora of potential stable factors or stable movements, key components of the movement, some are going to outweigh others depending on the movement. In the throw, specifically, certain things are going to outweigh other things, and these are in no particular order, but these will be ordered based on the individual athlete, and we can talk about that another time. The attractors are the stable components of the movement that allow that movement to be reproducible. When we look at the throw, we can think about different attractors. We can think about different stable components of the movement. We can break these down. We can look at each individual one. For today, I just want to talk about this one here. In Franz Bosch's book, I know Randy Sullivan, others as well, refer to hip lock at toe off or hip lock. Basically meaning that one hip comes into flexion, the other into extension, and there may be an amount of tilting that's going to maximize the stability of the pelvis and the co-contraction of the pelvis. But this isn't just co-contraction here, meaning all of the muscles around that joint are contracting to stabilize that joint and allow that joint to react very quickly and removing some of the slack in the tissue, but also we're maximizing joint congruency. And by simplifying this down to joint congruency, we can think about multiple different joints as opposed to being more specific at the hip, and I think that's what's really necessary for the throw. So a rudimentary pelvis here would have one hip going into relative flexion, while one hip goes into relative extension in the throw here. There's his baseball glove arm. So as this athlete begins to lift this toe off the ground, the pelvis has to stabilize as it only has one point of contact with the earth. In that way, the pelvis may have to tilt, meaning abduct on the leg that's down, while simultaneously keeping this hip in extension and this hip in flexion, stabilizing the pelvis, providing a stable foundation for everything that's up the kinetic chain. That's essentially hip lock at toe off, minus a few details as it pertains to pitching. In this position, the joints congruency is maximized, which I think is one of the more neglected components of hip lock at toe off, but also the hip musculature maintains a state of co-contraction where all the muscles are working together to stabilize the joints of the hip. But we can apply that same concept to the throwing shoulder. We see that throwing athletes of all levels end up with relatively similar amounts of abduction, approximately 90 up to 100 degrees of abduction, very rarely below that. We can talk about that here in a second, but also very rarely above that, especially in your elite level throwers. Your non-elite level throwers, you may see that. And I've tried to draw that here. I've tried to draw a little bit of that 90-degree angle to show you this. So when the humerus is abducted to 90 degrees, that's going to maximize congruency with the socket here. That's why it's closer to our closed pack position of the shoulder joint, 90 degrees abduction, in a little bit of external rotation in the scapular plane, or just very ever so slightly behind that, is going to maximize our joint congruency. But this is also the position where we can maximize the co-contraction of the joint. So we've maximized the joint congruency and we've maximized the co-contraction simultaneously to allow the shoulder to endure very high loads and also respond elastically later in the throw. So this video is essentially about, let's think of the attractor a little bit differently when we talk about the throw, but also we can expand some of these to encompass more of what's actually occurring in movements that are based on the upper and lower extremity. From my understanding, and I may be incorrect about this, books like Anatomy of Agility, which is a phenomenal book, I recommend everybody read it, are written from the perspective of many team sports. Most team sports don't involve the capacity of throwing, and if we need to think about throwing and develop this concept further, we need to think about all things that are happening or all components that are occurring during the throw. And the hip lock at toe off is not just about co-contraction of hip musculature, but it's also about maximizing pelvic and hip anatomy or congruency so that the hip fits together properly and is stable as possible. Similarly, we need to allow for motion, and that's a different aspect of joint congruency, say in the shoulder. And the reason that's important and the reason we drop below 90 degrees of abduction is because when you do so, you actually mechanically impinge the posterior aspect of the shoulder. The body inherently does not want to put itself in provocative impingement positions where the joint doesn't have freedom of motion and is similarly not that stable. That's where dislocation generally occurs. So maximizing joint congruency doesn't mean making it the tightest closed pack position, but rather the most stable position that will allow the freest motion to occur, or at times limit the motion depending on, number one, how the muscles contract, and also number two, which is the task, what is the goal here? If the goal is to throw the baseball as fast as we can, we know that we need external rotation or rotation of the shoulder to occur. Down here it doesn't occur. You can do the test yourself. I jam into a firm end feel Whereas up here, it doesn't happen. I have more freedom of motion up there because of how the shoulder articulates and allows more motion here, whereas it actually mechanically impinges down here. So abduction needs to be at least 90 degrees in the majority of individuals. Some individuals, Max Scherzer, others can get away with just a little bit lower. But that's another attractor. Just like hip lock at toe off isn't exact joint positions, neither is 90 degrees of abduction at the shoulder, but based on individual anatomy, we can fit them into joint congruency and co-contraction, a key attractor for the throw. We'll expand more on attractors moving forward. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, so we'd like to get more into depth on some of our key biomechanical concepts, theories, and motor learning science moving forward.